Attention. Nationwide emergency is in effect. All citizens are ordered to evacuate.
Dead Space 2 since release has been a fan favorite game in the franchise, with its focus on player feedback from the original title, focusing on the action days into a necromorph outbreak, rather than the creeping horror several days into an outbreak. Within Dead Space 2, we follow Isaac's journey through the sprawl in his quest to rid himself of the dementia slithering through his mind and eventual destruction of the marker, with as many twists and turns in this gripping horror action classic. However, in my time of playing through the game, I found disappointment with a few things, but one in particular that I found to be the biggest missed opportunity in Dead Space 2. The fear factor in the first game had been what was so great about the game, especially when you factor in the plot twist that had many scratching their heads on their first playthrough and second guessing what they had thought they had been seeing, questioning what had been real when walking through the halls of the Ishimura. But that is missed in the second game, what with the filter that flashes on screen whenever Nicole pops into frame, which doesn't hint to the player that this isn't real, but it informs the player that this isn't real. It's like the developers of Dead Space 2 thought people wouldn't be able to work that out, but that's why the first game had been so haunting, especially when you factor in the Easter egg at the end of the game, by taking the first letter of each chapter and spelling it out, which I remember feeling like the game had been trying to tell me of Nicole's fate this whole time. Having a flash every time a hallucination happens just strips away the illusion and immersion of all of that, as you can easily recognize what is real and what is hallucination. The hallucinations would have been more impactful if that filter hadn't been added in, and would have been more terrifying to a newcomer of the series. Glenn had even said that the intention of the first game had always been to make the scariest game possible, which I think is why the first game had been so successful for the time. Could you imagine walking through a hallway and then seeing a shadow dart across the end of the corridor? Or having a necromorph appear that resembled Nicole's face, without it being accompanied by the flash or filter of a hallucination? It certainly would have been more impactful. Something similar actually happens when Isaac is left with no choice but to enter the halls of the Ishimura for a second time, in order to use the gravity tethers to his advantage, where for the first 5 or so minutes, we aren't battling necromorphs or forced to watch an unskippable cutscene, but rather we are left to soak in the ambience and subtle music beats when revisiting the Ishimura for the first time in Dead Space 2. Where we move through those eerie corridors and hallways, we are suddenly interrupted by Nicole whispering in our ear, trying to break Isaac down with the trauma of what happened in the Ishimura in Dead Space.
You can pretend not to be bothered, but being here rattles your doesn't it, Isaac? All this blasting and tape covering the scars, trying to hide the blood and the body so no one will ever know.
It becomes more haunting when you enter the tram control room, hearing the Aegis 7 broadcasts and distress calls among the white flashing lights in the dark room, which reminds me of Chapter 3 in Dead Space, where you travel to the engine room.
Exiting vacuum.
When you listen to the audio logs, you can hear how the ship itself seems to be haunted, not just by the hidden memories, but also by the influence of the marker, as these workers end up feeling like the ship is cursed, with one falling over after feeling like someone had just tripped them when there wasn't anyone nearby, and hearing scratches coming from the walls and vents, like the necromorphs had been there with them long before the outbreak had even occurred, giving us this creeping feeling. All of this was amazing the first time going through it, almost like the intention of scaring the player was back, building the tension that the first game did so well. which is sad when the tension is suddenly broken by the emergence of not just one, but two brutes, and Ellie telling us that the necromorphs are swarming into the ship, which I found to be such a huge coincidence that the necromorphs are only just entering the ship when you are there, and not before. It's like the developers had thought that this level would have been boring to players if they didn't give a reason for necromorphs to be there. However, I argue that it would have instilled some much needed horror back into the game, as the developers could have focused on giving us a fresh experience when revisiting the ship, focusing on psychological horror rather than continuing the same action horror experience, similar to what Bungie had done with Halo Combat Evolved, where the whole game had been this action-based shooter experience with some chilled out moments to break up the experience and stellar music performances. But when you arrive at the swamp, the Covenant are scattered. You hear radios off in the distance, hearing of how the captain had been captured by enemy forces, and seeing friendlies on your radar, but when you look to their position, all you see are some shadowy figures on the horizon that run away from you when you move towards them. The Covenant forces are without their elite leaders, and you get that feeling that just something isn't right here, with some instances of friendly gunfire coming from a structure, but upon further investigation you find nothing but an elevator. When you descend down the shaft and travel through the halls of this bloodied facility, you come across the first Marine, but he's been driven mad, telling us of how they won't turn him. What this means is unclear, but continues to give you this sinking feeling and confirms that something is very wrong here. Eventually you find another Marine and Chief watches a recording of the expedition and what had happened to them, and eventually the player is introduced to an all-new enemy, the Flood. That introduction and twist to the action shoot-'em-up game is legendary to this day, and this should have been the main focus point for the return to the USG Ishimura, where you could have had Nicole teasing Isaac, tormenting him, clawing away at his mind, even having some brief appearances of necromorphs all adorning Nicole's face. Maybe when Isaac travels to the decontamination room, we see a familiar setting from the original game, with necromorphs attempting to break through the glass and exiting through the ceiling vents, but all you hear is the scratching and clawing sounds. But this time, a fight doesn't break out. Maybe we see another survivor sitting in a hallway with a broken leg and is thankful that someone actually bothered to look for them, and Isaac tries to help the poor survivor only to find on a second glance that Isaac had been talking to a corpse the whole time, showing that the dementia had been getting worse. That pushes Isaac to the breaking point. Maybe we see a spotlight off in the distance behind a corner, illuminating the dark hallway wall with a shadow piercing the light, only to find nothing on the other side. This would continue this dreaded feeling that we got from the first game. Maybe instead of a tram breaking down when we arrive at the medical deck, we instead have to travel to the medical deck because the tram is blocked by debris, forcing us to make our way through that specific area to get to the tram, where Nicole could toy with Isaac even more. Maybe some brief glimpses of Mercer and Kyne could have been used here, and Nicole asking Isaac if he even remembers Kendra and Hammond, or the pilots, or if they aren't important enough to mention. Like Isaac is the same as Earthgov, trying to cover up their existence within his memories. Maybe Isaac feels guilty that he couldn't save them, where Nicole could gaslight him into thinking that he failed them. I think this could have been a great moment, as if we saw Isaac getting scared or even terrified, or maybe even succumbing to this level of trauma and torment, then it would equally scare the player, or give the player another sense of dread, adding to the tension, but only to see Isaac, after a moment of having a meltdown, compose himself and pull himself back up, which would give him a lot more character, showing him overcoming his demons as he travels through his own personal hell, just like a sequence in Extraction. And as the entities in the game become more real, when the characters are more fearful of their presence. Maybe we could have seen Hammond and Kendra as NPCs approach Isaac, telling him he failed them as a way for the marker to try and break him, to make him fall victim to its influence, just like how Stross had. Maybe even having Isaac becoming one with the corruption, where Isaac sinks into the floor, bringing us into a new area where there is no escape and all you have to do is survive against waves of shadowy necromorphs, and you hear a voice off in the distance only to find at the end of the sequence that Isaac had been asleep on the tram rather than fighting for his life, making him question what is even real now. It would be even better if Ellie hadn't been able to contact Isaac in this chapter, as it would add to the immersion of everything happening around you. Maybe his comlink becomes scrambled as he enters the Ishimura. Maybe there is a device on the ship that Isaac has to destroy to regain contact with Ellie. Perhaps we see a scene from Dead Space Downfall return when we get to the bridge of Kynes struggle with the captain, but then the captain stops and turns towards Isaac, telling his men to arrest him before the illusion is suddenly shattered by a slasher grabbing a hold of Isaac, where the scene subtly tells us that Isaac had been seeing the flight crew when they actually had been a group of necromorphs. All of this combined, I feel, would have made for a more fearful, dreadful, and a more engaging experience, especially when looking at past characters, as there are no mentions of older characters even existing, and Isaac never acknowledges anything to do with them, which is something I wish he would just mumble to himself at times. But if not that, then maybe having them be present in hallucinations, which would give the player the hint that while Isaac doesn't talk about these things, he certainly does think on them, and of how he failed them, feeling guilty not just over Nicole but over Hammond and Kendra as well. It's not like I don't like the level that had been given to us, but I just want more from the experience, not just more action, but more dread, as the only dread I feel in this level is when I play on harder difficulties rather than something that is actually built into the story. But tell me, what would you change in Dead Space 2 that you feel would strengthen the impact of the story, or the reason that you wouldn't change anything at all? Special thank you to the members of the channel: Hammond, Sithlord906, Killer1260v2, Stabber OP Sig, Bronze 189, Ero Solano, Art Gains, Eric Harrison, Huckcast, and to the Legend members, Afron2371 and Michael Boss. Thank you for giving that extra support to the channel, and if you want to become a member and gain exclusive benefits like early access to new videos as soon as possible, then hit the join button and click on the tier that's right for you. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all back here very soon for some more history deep dives, lore, and much more in the future. Let me know what you think about the topics discussed in the comments, and I look forward to hearing from you. And be sure to join the British Alliance today by subscribing to the channel, and make sure to have all notifications on so you never miss a video. And I will see you all very soon. And be sure to leave this video having a good one.